This is part 3 of the GEO503 summer 2014 June 9th lecture. We're picking off where we left off on the showing how to develop a web calculation tool using HTML. And we had programmed the first half of the HTML table that will provide the user instructions and receive numbers from the user to calculate. At the beginning of this slide, we have another placeholder row with a height of 20 pixels to separate content a little bit better. Following that placeholder, I have another row starting with tr, see that with td, and a text input, txt value. This text input tag is where the user will enter the number that would be used for the calculation. Notice just after this I have a div tag. We talked about how div tags are often used as an area on an HTML page to retrieve or write dynamic content. That's how we'll use it here. The div tag ID label result kind of gives away what we'll use it for. This is where we'll write the result of our calculation. And we'll use the my header class, the larger font. Below that, finally, we use the button input type. This is with the text run on it. This is what the user will click to make the program work. Notice that the button on click event will run of a JavaScript function called calculate. We don't need to pass any arguments because, as you'll see momentarily, the JavaScript function retrieves the values right from the tags that we've just programmed. Now that we've set up the GUI, we haven't talked much about that. That stands for Graphic User Interface. So the HTML is the Graphic User Interface. The functionality will now take place within JavaScript. And we talked when we introduced JavaScript about enclosing JavaScript within a script tag. Pictured here is the start of the script tag. Make sure you have the type equals text/JavaScript attribute like pictured here, and the language equals JavaScript attribute. And from the previous slide, we know that we will start with a calculate function. So we begin a function with the name of the function, calculate, empty parentheses because there are no arguments, and then the function content begins with curly brackets. The first line in the function var input text, notice this, equals text value dot value. If you recall, text value was the ID of the text box where the user enters the number. So we are getting what was typed into the text box into this input text variable. Recall, I believe on June 4th, we talked about the isNaN function in JavaScript. NaN stands for not a number. This if block that you see here tests to see if the user entered something that's not a valid number. We're not going to be able to continue with a calculation if no valid number was entered. So if that is the case, we need to alert the user with an alert box, and then return will exit the program. There's no point in continuing without a valid number. So that's the first functionality in our JavaScript code that you see here. Following that if block, make sure you type it after the curly bracket ending the if loop. We will now proceed with the calculation. I'm not sure if we've talked about this much yet. We will going forward. But label result was the div tag. A common feature of a function method property on a div tag is inner HTML, as pictured here. This allows us to get and set actual HTML in the div tag and lets us dynamically change what it looks like. And notice I have it just as a placeholder set to Greg. We're then going to define some numbers and text strings that will be used later. Note also one of the text strings we define blank to begin with is my conversion, myconv. This is where we're going to determine which of the radio buttons were checked. Based on that, we will set my conversion appropriately to the appropriate string. And notice we do just that at the conclusion of this slide with the 3 if statements. If RDO miles, and notice, and another thing you can see here is the radio button. The radio type input tag has a property checked. That property will return true if it's been checked. And so, for example, if RDO miles checked returns true, that means the user must have selected the miles conversion, and we'll set that appropriately with myconv equals miles. Once we have determined that, we will use a switch statement to determine which case is true, which of the 3 conversions was input, and then write some code within each of those cases to actually make the conversion. So let me pick the first one as an example. If my conversion was equal to miles, the first case in the switch statement will run. We are creating a new number that takes the input miles and multiplies that by 1.609. That's the metric conversion. And we set 2 values that will be used for the label at the bottom of this page. My units 1 indicates the input units. My units 2 indicates the output units. And don't forget a break at the end of every case in a switch statement. The cases for inches and miles are similar. Actually, that third one should actually read Fahrenheit. Or temperature, so they're not miles. There's a typo here. At the very end of this slide, you see us resetting the inner HTML of the label result div tag to display the old number and units, then the word is, and then the new number and units. So basically that's where we'll say what we will indicate the conversion is. Let's test out the website now. As you've seen, we've done this in class a number of times. But right-click in the code, select the View in Browser command. That'll open up a web browser with our web page. And if you're following along, you'll see the same thing too. If you're doing Lab 1, you'll see here. Hopefully it works as well for you as pictured here. Pictured here in the lower right is our code working. I've selected Fahrenheit to Celsius, type 65, and notice the correct conversion is noted on the slide here. So I said the previous group of slides will be very useful for Lab 1. It basically is Lab 1. I'm now going to spend a little bit of time talking about jQuery. We may not end up using jQuery very much in the class. Not too many of the ArcGIS JavaScript examples that we go over will use jQuery, but I want to, as future JavaScript programmers, I want to make you aware of jQuery. And as you read the definition here, it's a fast, what is jQuery? A feature-rich JavaScript library. Basically, it takes some of the things that we do in JavaScript and makes it easier. You can find out a lot about jQuery, including its reference, and from the website jQuery.com. jQuery is widely used in JavaScript development. jQuery mostly works with the HTML document object model. This is link buttons, image buttons, input types, things that we just did. There isn't anything in jQuery that you couldn't do with JavaScript natively, but jQuery usually is quicker and more efficient. So there's often a use for jQuery. To utilize jQuery, it must be referenced using a script tag. When we first talked about JavaScript, we talked about a way to reference external JavaScript, and this is how we'll do that. We will also do that a lot in the ArcGIS Server API when we'll reference ESRI's JavaScript. But in that case and this case, unlike the examples earlier this evening where we typed our own JavaScript, you're actually representing, you're linking to jQuery's JavaScript file. So here is the procedure to do that. Navigate to jQuery.com download. Maybe we'll take a look at that. Slow to come up this evening. There's a lot of information about jQuery on this page. We can go right to download. And here's where you would download the latest release. And I'm actually used to using jQuery 1.9 and 1.11. I know there's a newer jQuery about to be released. There's often updates coming. So here's where you would download the compressed or uncompressed production jQuery. This is the compressed version. We'll talk about this in a second. And there's the uncompressed version. You actually can download this. I said we'll reference right from jQuery, and you can do that. Sometimes if you are working in an environment without an internet connection, you may have to download the JavaScript file to your own machine and reference it. And this is where you would do that. So notice this is a JavaScript file that you could put on your own server. So the first way to do this, as I just showed, would be download the latest version. Right-click, save link as. And then now I've saved that JavaScript file to my local machine. And this slide just shows that same process. Then in your code, to utilize jQuery, it must be referenced in your HTML page using a script tag. So pictured here is one line of code in your HTML file that would reference your local jQuery. Notice, and this is a best practice, often we put JavaScript files in a folder called scripts that's one level below your website. So if your website is here, say this is my website, my first map, I would create a folder called scripts, and you'd create other files, the styles for style sheets, images, and put images below it and so on, and move my file into the scripts folder. And then now in the HTML file I would reference it this way. So the HTML file looks for this JavaScript file in the subfolder scripts and reference it. For C# programmers, this is akin to using a using statement. Now once this has been referenced, any functions in that JS file are available on your HTML page. Notice I showed and mentioned that there's two versions of the JS file of the jQuery available. There's an uncompressed versus a compressed version. It's basically the same file, but with all the spaces removed. Obviously, the uncompressed version is much easier to read. So while developing the site, when you need to reference the jQuery, if you want to reference the jQuery JavaScript, you may want to have the uncompressed version available. But in a production site, remember we're transferring a lot of data back and forth on the internet. Anything you can do to increase speed is good. One of the things you can do is reduce the file size by removing all unneeded spaces. The spaces in the uncompressed file are used by humans to read. The computer doesn't need that. The computer looks at semicolons as the end of the line, doesn't care about returns. So the file on the left is actually exactly the same to the compiler as uncompressed, but it takes up less space and hence would run faster. You can also, and this is actually preferred in most cases, reference the jQuery library directly from the internet. This is actually often faster than your own server. Many of these sites that do this are hosted on massive server farms that are designed for this and can often, I've seen this myself, produce response times quicker than your own server, believe it or not. And the term for these sites are CDNs, Content Delivery Network. We'll use ESRI CDNs a little bit later, but one CDN that we use for jQuery is provided by Google. And notice the URL here. So you can reference that same 1.1.1 jQuery file from this site at ajax.googleapis.com.